This morning, the Defence Secretary Gavin Williamson indicated that he will be asking for more money from the Chancellor as part of his defence review. His comments come amid widespread speculation about possible cuts to personnel and equipment and calls to increase defence spending to 3% of GDP from some MPs. But what about Trident, our nuclear missile deterrent, which will soon need replacing? Would the money spent on a replacement be better spent elsewhere? Well, here's our guest of the day, Peter Hitchens, on his soapbox.
Britain's defence policy is like a man who spends so much on insuring himself against alien abduction that he can't afford cover for fire and theft. Army chiefs have been warning this week that our conventional defences are frighteningly short of equipment, men and money. But what they won't say in public is that a major reason for the squeeze is the vast expense of building 4 new Trident submarines, Leviathans, hugely bigger than this 1960s relic HMS Ocelot, veteran of countless top-secret missions against the Soviet Union. Unlike Ocelot here, the new Trident boats are museum pieces before they've even been laid down. Like her, they're Cold War weapons, but built 30 years after the Cold War ended. Elaborate, complex and huge, they were designed to deter the enormous Soviet armies in East Germany, which long ago melted away. And they're a superpower weapon, decades after we ceased to be any such thing. If we were a superpower, we could make our own missiles rather than lease them from the USA, as we more or less do. Israel, a country with many irreconcilable enemies, and under far more risk of attack than we are, doesn't have anything like so elaborate or costly. So why should we? The choice isn't between Trident and nothing. The new submarines will come in at somewhere between £31 billion over 35 years, the government estimate, or £175 billion if you don't believe the government estimate, as I tend not to do. You can't help thinking that some of this money will come out of funds that could otherwise be spent on usable conventional weapons. The Tories and Labour Blairites think Trident is a very useful weapon with which to attack Jeremy Corbyn. But everyone in government knows that many in the military privately think it a vainglorious waste of money. Field Marshal Lord Bramall, too old to care what politicians say or do, openly says what many in the military can only think, that we should get rid of it. Nobody can call Lord Bramall a pacifist or a defeatist. He's living proof that there's a good, hard, patriotic argument for disposing of this unusable monstrosity before it destroys our real defences.
And we're joined in the studio now by the Chair of the Defence Select Committee, Julian Lewis, and of course Peter Hitchens is still here. Thank you very much for coming in, Julian Lewis. What did you make of Peter Hitchens' argument there that basically the money that's being spent on Trident would be much better put to conventional weapons and building up the army?
Yes, well, unfortunately, we're nowhere near spending enough on defence, irrespective of the contribution that Trident's expenditure of 31 to 41 billion pounds spent over a considerable number of years would make any significant difference to. I always say to people who use this argument, if you think that you would scoop up the money that otherwise would be spent on our ultimate insurance policy against nuclear aggression, namely the Trident system, if you think more than a fraction of that would go back into defence, you're really being a little bit unrealistic, And in reality,
why? We have a commitment to spend 2% of GDP on defence. That's
yes.
as part of our NATO membership. So surely the money from Trident would have to go back into defence spending.
The 2% commitment, this gets right to the heart of the issue. The 2% commitment is nowhere near enough. In the 10 long years of the Blair government, I was a shadow defence minister for the Conservatives, and I spent a lot of time arguing that they weren't spending enough when they were spending 2.5% of GDP, even when Peter's point, and it's a good point, that the Cold War came to an end at the end of the 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s. In the 1980s, we were spending 4.5% to 5% of GDP on defence. When it came to an end, we took the peace dividend cuts, and even years after we took the peace dividend cuts, do you know what we were spending in 1995 to 1996? Not barely 2% as at the moment. We were spending fully 3%. This would be a drop in the ocean, and we'd be losing our ultimate insurance policy.
Peter?
Well, a lot of things are a drop in the ocean, if you like. The army just currently is suffering from a serious recruitment crisis, and one of the reasons for that, in my belief, is that it's closed down an awful lot of its recruitment offices. The cost of that is tiny, but it's the sort of cut which the Defence Ministry is constantly making. It's trivial in itself, but many, many of these things, the army itself, as you know, is now smaller than the army which Vichy France was permitted to have by Hitler after being defeated by Germany. It's so tiny that it barely counts as an army anymore. The Navy is in a terrible crisis because of of many things, not least the overspending on aircraft carriers that we can't use, and the fact that a lot of its ships don't work and can't move. But it also hasn't got enough people, and it's been losing over the years many valuable, experienced NCO type people of the kind you can't easily replace. And these are not particularly expensive things, but the drain of money into Trident is one of the main reasons why these things are happening and will continue to happen for 30 years to come. Now the question is, do we need this thing? And also, I think it's all part of the process of national growing up. We really do need to understand that we are an important country, but we're not a superpower, and that we should start behaving as one and getting rid of this thing. And when we've got the chance to pull out of it before renewing it at vast expense would be a very useful moment of recognition of what we really need to be. We actually need to sit down and say, what do we need an army for? What do we need a navy for? What do we need an air force for? And what shape should they have? But that needs a moment of profound reflection and saying we're not a superpower anymore, and the Cold War is actually over would be a good starting point for that discussion. It would also save significant amounts of money. Sure, we could spend more, but within what we do spend, transferring the money that we spend on this to conventional defence would be a sensible move.
Well, can I just say, we were not a superpower at any stage during the Cold War. But during the Cold War, we spent regularly 5% of GDP on defence.
Peter's point is not just about the spending. He's suggesting that the nuclear weapons are a status symbol for the United Kingdom.
Well, this leads me to the second half of the argument, providing I have sufficiently managed to establish, as I hope I have, that our defence spending is so woefully low that until we get to the point where we've got a defence secretary, and we might just have one now, who is prepared to say that we need to be spending more of the order of 3% of GDP, this sort of argument is going to make no realistic difference. And do you know what? Michael Fallon, who defended the government line through all his years as Secretary of State for Defence, now he isn't Secretary of State for Defence, has an article in the Daily Telegraph saying, do you know what? We need to be spending at least 2.5% of GDP. So I think we're winning that argument, Peter. Let's not divert onto Trident for the money point of view. The argument about why we need Trident is simple. Trident has never been to deter the major armies of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Trident is to ensure that no country can ever be misled into thinking that it could blackmail us into surrender by the threat of using nuclear weapons against us, which we would have no means of retaliating for. And even one Trident submarine is able to inflict such damage in retaliation. Not only is it unacceptable, it is unavoidable. It is not a panacea. It does not meet other forms of military threat. I'll just finish the sentence, if I may, Peter. It does not deter every form of military threat. What it does do is deter the one form of threat, which is nuclear attack, without which, a defence without which you would be incapable of defending yourself, no matter how strong your conventional
well, let Peter
Okay,
respond
well, as
to
you well know, British nuclear weapons were originally developed because we were annoyed by the Americans. Ernest Bevin came out of a meeting with James Burns, the then Secretary of State, so furious at the way he'd been treated that he said, we are going to build our own nuclear bombs, come what may. And a lot of the building of and the testing of British nuclear weapons in the 1950s was specifically for that purpose, to demonstrate we were still important. Then we became, because of the failure of Blue Streak and the cancellation of Blue Steel, dependent upon the Americans for our missiles. Then it became an issue of whether we could destroy Moscow.
Okay.
And Trident, the reason for the development first of Cheveline and then of Trident was so we could continue to be able to destroy Moscow. And the reason for these incredibly expensive submarines is to try and evade the Soviet Navy.
Okay.
These issues simply do not exist anymore.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Julian Lewis for coming in to talk about